In a forgotten town at the edge of the mountains where the air always smelled of rust and rain, fear ruled every corner of every broken street, and silence had become the safest language to speak. The people lived like shadows, hiding from the monsters that walked among them. They called those monsters the dragons, not because they breathed fire, but because they consumed everything in their path with a hunger that could never be filled. The dragons were men, once, or so people said, men who had traded their souls for power and their mercy for control. Their leader, a man known only as Rico, had eyes so cold that even dogs refused to look at him directly. He ruled the town like a king of ashes, demanding money, food, and respect from everyone who wanted to stay alive. Every week, black trucks rolled in from the highway, engines growling like beasts as they stopped in front of the old church where Rico's men collected tribute from trembling hands, sacks of rice, jewelry, sometimes even children's bicycles, anything that proved loyalty. Those who could not pay disappeared. Sometimes their houses burned in the night. Sometimes their names were scratched off the town records as if they had never existed at all. No one dared to question it, not even the sheriff, who drank himself numb in the bar that the dragons owned. The townspeople spoke in whispers about the day when someone might stand against them, but those whispers died fast. Fear was quicker than courage, and hope was too expensive to afford. It was said that years ago, a few men had tried to fight back, forming a group called the Keepers, but the dragons found them, tied them to trees outside town, and left their bodies hanging as a warning. Since then, no one dared to dream of freedom. The children grew up believing that the dragons were not men, but forces of nature, unstoppable like storms or earthquakes. It was easier that way, easier to think of them as something beyond human, something that could not be fought. And so, life continued like a story told too many times, the same fear, the same silence, the same tribute every week, until the stranger came. Arrived one afternoon when the sky was heavy with thunder and the mountains looked like sleeping giants. His name was Elias, or at least that was the name he gave. He carried nothing but a duffel bag and a gaze that seemed to see through walls. He spoke little, worked quietly, fixing roofs, mending fences, and helping the elderly for coins or food. At first, people thought he was just another drifter, lost like so many others, but there was something in the way he moved, calm and steady, like a man who had seen too much and forgotten how to fear. The children followed him, sometimes watching from a distance, curious about the scars on his arms and the strange tattoo on his wrist that looked like a broken chain. He never smiled, but when he looked at the horizon, his eyes burned, like there was something waiting for him out there, something he could not escape. And though no one knew it yet, the town had just welcomed a storm greater than any they had ever faced. The dragons came every month, but that month they came earlier than usual. The sound of their trucks echoed through the valley long before sunrise, waking even the animals that hid beneath the broken barns. The people knew what that meant. Someone had failed to pay, someone had been late, and late meant punishment. The town moved in silence, shutters closed, doors locked, hearts pounding behind thin walls, because no one wanted to be seen. When Rico arrived, Rico never forgave, and he never forgot. The trucks stopped at the church like they always did, the engines still rumbling like angry beasts. Rico stepped out, dressed in black boots polished like mirrors, his shirt open, showing gold chains and a chest tattoo of a dragon curling across his ribs. His eyes scanned the town slowly, as if he could smell guilt in the air. His men jumped off the trucks, carrying rifles, laughing and shouting names of people who owed money. The fear spread like smoke through the streets. Old man tried to beg, but Rico hit him once, just once, and the sound of it was enough to remind everyone of their place. A woman dropped to her knees, offering her wedding ring. Another handed over a bag of flour. A boy barely 15 ran to fetch the last of his family's coins. The air was thick with dust and dread, and no one dared to breathe too loudly. Elias watched from the corner of the square, his hands resting on the handle of the wheelbarrow he had been pushing. He stood still, eyes steady, as the dragons moved through the crowd, taking whatever they pleased. He had seen men like them before, the kind who believed fear made them gods. He had seen it in other towns, in other countries, where the powerful crushed the weak for sport. He had thought he had left that life behind, but watching Rico made something stir inside him, something that had been buried under years of silence. Rico noticed him eventually. Because Rico noticed everything, he tilted his head, studying the stranger, the man who did not look away. Most people avoided his eyes. This one did not. He walked over, boots clicking against the stones, stopping just close enough to test the man's nerve. "Who are you?" he asked, but Elias did not answer. He simply nodded once and went back to his work. The tension hung between them like a wire pulled too tight. The townspeople held their breath, waiting for Rico to explode, but instead he laughed. That kind of laugh that makes your skin crawl, and said, "The new guy has spirit, let us see how long that lasts." Then he turned away, waving his hand for his men to finish their work, and soon the trucks rolled out again, leaving behind silence and the smell of exhaust. When they were gone, the people came out slowly, glancing at Elias, some in fear, some in curiosity, a few in quiet admiration. He had not flinched, he had not bowed, he had looked the dragon in the eyes and lived, and though he said nothing, a storm had already started to build behind his calm asterisk. Days passed after the dragon's visit, and the town tried to breathe again, but the air felt heavier than before, as if something unseen had changed. Beneath the surface the people worked in silence, but their thoughts were restless. Every conversation ended in whispers about the stranger and the way he had stared down Rico like a man who did not know fear, or maybe like a man who no longer cared about living. Some said he was foolish. Others said he was cursed, yet deep down they all felt something different, something like the first spark of hope in a place that had forgotten the taste of it. Elias kept to his routine, waking before dawn, working until sunset, fixing what was broken. Without asking for payment, if someone insisted, he took only what he needed: bread, water, a place to sleep. He did not speak of where he came from, and no one dared to ask, but people began to notice things. Small things, the way stray dogs followed him through the streets, the way his hand shook when he heard loud engines, the scars that traced his back. Like maps of old pain, he carried himself like a soldier, but one who had no uniform left to wear. One afternoon the children found him by the river building something from scrap metal and wood. They asked what it was, but he only smiled faintly and said it was for protection. They laughed, thinking it was a toy, until they saw the glint of steel beneath the dirt. He told them to stay away from the river after dark, his voice calm but cold enough to make them listen. That night, the dragons returned, not for tribute but for sport. They were drunk, laughing, firing their guns into the sky as they drove through the narrow streets. They stopped by the small bar where music still played from a cracked radio and dragged the owner outside, accusing him of keeping secrets. Rico was not there this time, only his second in command, a man called Toro, whose temper was as short as his neck. He beat the bar owner in front of everyone, demanding to know who had helped him hide the missing payment. Elias was walking home when he saw it, the crowd silent, the man bleeding, the laughter of the dragons echoing like thunder. Something inside him snapped, like a wire breaking under too much strain. He stepped forward and told them to stop, his voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. For a moment even Toro hesitated, then he smiled, the kind of smile that hides cruelty, and said, "Look, boys, the hero wants to play." And before anyone could move, he swung a bottle toward Elias' head, but Elias caught his arm, twisted it until it cracked, and dropped him to the ground in one motion. The crowd gasped. No one had ever touched a dragon before. Elias stood over Toro, eyes steady as if waiting for something. Then he let go and walked away, leaving the man groaning in the dirt. The townspeople knew what that meant. They knew retribution would come with fire and bullets, but even so, a strange feeling crept through the air that night, a feeling none of them had known in years, the feeling that the dragons could bleed. Morning came heavy and silent, the streets empty, as if the town itself was holding its breath after what had happened the night before. The sky hung low over the mountains, gray and swollen with rain. Elias was already awake, sitting outside the small shed he called home, sharpening a knife that looked far older than he was. His movements were slow, measured, every sound of metal scraping against stone echoing in the damp air. He knew what would come. The dragons never forgot a slight, they never forgave a wound, and Toro would not rest until he had his revenge across town. The people whispered behind closed doors. The bar owner lay in bed, his face bruised and swollen, but his eyes alive for the first time in years. He kept saying the same thing over and over. He stopped them. He actually stopped them. Some were proud, some were terrified, because standing up to the dragons was not bravery, it was suicide. No one survived that kind of defiance, not for long. By midday the troughs came again. 3 of them, engines roaring like beasts, ready to hunt. The doors swung open and men poured out, rifles slung across their backs, faces hard with anger. Toro was not with them. His arm had been broken clean at the joint, but Rico was there, and that meant blood. The townspeople watched from windows, curtains half closed, hearts pounding. Rico stepped into the square, his boots echoing on the stones, his voice carrying like thunder as he called for Elias, the stranger who thought himself brave. "Come, Al," he shouted. "Come show the people what courage looks like." When it did, Elias appeared from the end of the street, walking slowly, his shirt torn, his hands empty. The rain began to fall, thin cold drops that tapped against metal and stone. He stopped a few steps away from Rico, his eyes calm, unreadable like still water. Rico smiled, a cruel, slow smile. "You think you can touch my men and live," he said. "You think this town will protect you?" Elias said nothing, and for a moment the world felt like it was holding still. Even the rain seemed to hang in the air. Then Elias spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "You have taken enough," he said. "Leave these people or I will make you leave." Rico laughed so hard it almost sounded like disbelief. Then he nodded once to his men, and the air filled with motion. Rifles lifted, shouts rose, and in that chaos, Elias moved faster than anyone expected. His hand flashed, the knife spinning in the rain. One man fell, another stumbled, and in the confusion, Elias vanished into the alleyways, leaving only the echo of his footsteps and the shock of fear behind. Rico's rage was a storm that could not be contained. He ordered the men to burn every house that had ever fed Elias, every person who had ever spoken his name. And by nightfall, smoke covered the sky, flames devoured the edges of the town, and the people realized that the line had been crossed. There would be no peace, no silence, no obedience anymore. Something had begun, and there was no turning back. Fell over the burning town, and the sky glowed red like an open wound. The flames climbed higher than the rooftops, and the smoke twisted into the clouds like dark serpents. The air was thick with heat and fear. People ran, carrying what little they could, children crying, elders coughing as the fire devoured their homes. Rico watched from the steps of the church, his face lit by the firelight, calm, as if the destruction was a prayer. Only he understood. His men laughed, shooting into the air, drinking from bottles, tossing torches into windows. It was a celebration of power and terror, mixed into one endless nightmare. But somewhere in the smoke, Elias moved like a shadow, unseen by the firelight, his face streaked with soot, his eyes cold as stone. He carried no gun, only the same old knife, and a plan that had been forming in his mind long before that night. He knew the patterns of men like Rico, the arrogance that made them blind, the cruelty that made them predictable. He had seen it before, in the places the world preferred to forget. He slipped through alleys where the flames had not yet reached, guiding families toward the river, his voice quiet but firm. "Move now, do not stop, do not look back." A boy no older than 12 clung to his arm, asking why he was helping, and Elias simply said, "Because someone once helped me." Before the boy could ask more, Elias was gone again, swallowed by the smoke. By dawn, the fire had consumed half the town, the rest lay in ashes. The dragons were gone, leaving behind the wreckage. They called order. Rico promised he would return in 3 days, and when he did, he wanted the stranger's head on display, where he would finish what he started. The people were too broken to speak, too numb to cry. They buried what was left and waited for the next storm. Elias watched from the hills above the town, exhausted but unshaken. He had been hurt, a shallow cut on his shoulder and burns along his arm. But his mind was clear. He remembered every scream, every gunshot, every face that watched their world burn, and he felt something stir inside him again, something he had buried deep years ago when he walked away from violence. He had promised himself never to become that man again, but some promises die when innocence does. He found an old hunting cabin in the woods miles away and began to prepare. He scavenged fuel, knives, wire, and an old radio. He fixed it with trembling hands, tuning it to catch the faint signals from passing trucks. He listened to the dragons' movements, to their roots and patterns. He knew how they operated now, where they slept, where they stored their weapons. Rico had made a mistake by touching the innocent, because now Elias had no reason left to hide. He whispered to himself in the dark the words cold and certain. "They wanted a monster, now they will see what." And as the sun rose over the blackened town, the people began to whisper again, not about the dragons, but about the man who had survived the fire and vanished into the hills. The man they had once offered as a sacrifice, now waiting in the shadows, becoming the thing they feared most. The days that followed were carved from silence. The town lay in ruins, black smoke still curling from what once were homes. The air smelled of ashes and grief, and every sound felt too loud in the emptiness. The people buried their dead in shallow graves by the river, too afraid to dig deeper in case the dragons returned. Their faces were gray, their eyes hollow, and every glance carried the same question: when would they come back? Because everyone knew Rico always came back, but high in the hills. Elias watched the valley through broken binoculars that had survived too many wars. He marked every road, every movement of trucks that passed along the highway. Every night he moved through the forest like a shadow, laying traps along the old trails, setting wires between trees, digging shallow pits where tires would burst. He worked without rest, without hesitation. He ate little. He slept less, each hour shaped by purpose and fury. He remembered the faces of the dragons, the way they laughed the night the flames rose. He remembered Tora's broken arm and Rico's cold smile, and he carried those memories like weapons, sharper than any blade. He found the ruins of their old hideout. Days later, a bunker built from concrete and greed buried at the edge of the forest. It was empty, but the smell of oil and blood still clung to the walls. He stayed there for hours, searching every room, every corner, until he found a box of radios and ammunition buried beneath a false floor. It was then he knew the dragons were planning something bigger, something beyond the town. Elias set up camp in the ruins, using the radios to listen to their chatter. He heard their voices through the static, cruel and careless, talking about a shipment, about new men coming from the city, and about a list of people to make examples of. He heard Rico's voice, clear and calm, like a man ordering dinner, and when he said the name of the boy Elias had saved from the fire, something inside Elias snapped. The night the storm returned, thunder rolling over the valley like a drum of war. The rain fell hard, washing the ashes from the earth. Elias walked through it, carrying a backpack filled with fuel and wire, the cold water dripping from his hair, his eyes burning with purpose. He moved toward the bridge, where the dragons' trucks would pass before dawn. Every step slow, steady, silent. The wind howled, but he kept walking. When the first truck appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the storm, Elias stood in the middle of the road, waiting, soaked in rain, his face hidden in the dark. The driver saw him too late. The explosion lit up the valley like lightning. The bridge collapsed under fire and steel, and 4 miles the echo of it rolled through the mountains. In the town below, people woke in fear and awe. They saw the sky glow and heard the thunder, and for the first time in years, the sound did not mean destruction. It meant the dragons had finally bled, and the whispers began again. Low and trembling, maybe, just maybe, the monster had turned on the monstrous. By morning, the smoke from the bridge still rose into the gray sky, black and heavy, drifting over the valley like a warning. No one dared to speak of what had happened, but everyone knew it was him, the stranger, the man who had walked into fire and come out unburned. The dragons had lost men that night, and the sound of the blast carried far enough to reach the city, where Rico waited. When he heard of it, he said nothing for a long time. Then he poured himself a drink and told Toro to gather everyone, every truck, every weapon. He wanted the hills burned to the ground. He wanted the stranger's body found and hung in the square for all to see, the ruins above the town. Elias listened through the crackling radio, hearing their rage, their confusion, the fear in their voices buried under bravado. He could almost see their faces, twisted with disbelief, men who had never been challenged. Suddenly realizing they were not untouchable, he smiled once, a small, tired smile, not of joy but of understanding. He had become what they feared most, something they could not control or predict. He spent the day preparing, moving through the forest. Like a ghost, he set traps along the trails and wired the paths with explosives he salvaged from old mines. He knew the land now, every stone, every bend, every shadow. He knew how to make it fight for him when the time came. He carved lines into the dirt, marking their roots, marking their doom. The rain came again and he welcomed it, the cold drops washing the sweat and blood from his skin. In the town below, the people argued. Some wanted to flee before the dragons returned, others said to stay to hide. They spoke of Elias like he was both savior and curse. They feared what he would bring, yet they could not deny the flicker of hope that now burned among the ruins, a hope that maybe the dragons could die, maybe the town could be free. As night fell, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the forest, looking down at the lights of the town. He thought of the boy he had saved, of the faces of those who had lost everything, and for a moment he felt the weight of what he had become. He had killed before in places far from here for reasons he barely remembered, but this time it's different. This time it was personal. This time it was justice. Then he heard the sound he had been waiting for, engines roaring in the distance, growing louder, headlights cutting through the darkness. Rico was coming with his army of men and fire. Elias closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered into the storm, "It ends tonight." He moved into the shadows, vanishing between the trees, his knife gleaming faintly in the rain. Down below, the first trucks entered the valley, the dragons laughing, shouting, sure of their strength, unaware that the hills around them were alive with traps and ghosts. And as the wind rose, carrying the scent of smoke and metal, the town held its breath, waiting for the battle that would decide who the real monster truly was. The night swallowed the valley in darkness, broken only by the glare of headlights and the shimmer of rain that fell like needles. The dragons roared through the mud, their trucks heavy with guns and rage, the sound of engines echoing against the hills. They shouted curses into the storm, certain the stranger was hiding somewhere nearby. Rico sat in the lead truck, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes hard as stone. He was not a man who believed in ghosts, but something about that night felt wrong. The air too still, the forest too quiet, like the world was waiting for something to happen. Up in the trees, Elias crouched motionless, his clothes soaked his heartbeat slow, every sense alive. He watched the trucks move along the narrow road between the cliffs. His fingers rested on the detonator, his mind sharp and cold. He waited until the third truck passed, then pressed the button. The explosion tore through the silence. Fire and metal erupted into the night. The blast lit up the forest and threw men screaming into the mud. The echo rolled across the valley like thunder before the dragons could recover. Elias moved. He came out of the trees like a shadow, cutting through the smoke, his blade flashing, his step sure and silent. He struck fast, precise, no wasted motion, no hesitation. The men who had once laughed now shouted in terror, firing blindly into the dark. The rain turned red and the ground shook with every blast of fire from the burning trucks. Rico climbed from the wreck, his face lit by flames, his eyes searching. He shouted orders, calling his men cowards, his voice cutting through the chaos. But even he could feel it, the fear crawling under his skin. This was no simple fight, this was a hunt, and they were the prey. He saw a figure move between the flames, a man with a knife and eyes that glowed with fury. He raised his gun, fired once, twice. The shots vanished into the storm, and when he turned, the man was gone. The battle stretched through the night, fire, smoke and rain twisting together into one endless nightmare. By dawn, the road was littered with wreckage, the forest burned in patches, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, breathing hard, his hands shaking, blood on his arms. Not all of it his. He looked at the devastation, the broken trucks, the silence that followed, and knew it was almost over, but not yet. Rico was still alive. Rico crawled from the wreck, dragging his leg, blood pouring down his side. He saw Elias watching him and laughed, weak and hoarse. "You think this changes anything?" he said. "We are the dragons, we always come back." Elias walked closer, slow, calm, his knife at his side, his voice low. "No," he said, "not this time." And as the wind howled through the burning forest, the last of the dragons fell silent. When it was done, Elias turned away, leaving the fire behind him, his silhouette fading into the morning mist. The town below still sleeping, unaware that the war that had ruled them for years had ended in one night of rain and fire. Morning crept slowly over the valley, turning the smoke to mist and the ash to silver dust. The forest still burned in quiet patches, the smell of oil and blood hanging in the air like a memory that refused to fade. The town below stirred to life, timid and trembling. The people came out from their homes, stepping into streets that were no longer watched by black trucks. No engines, no shouts, only silence, deep and unfamiliar. They saw the smoke rising from the hills and wondered what it meant. Some feared the dragons had returned, others whispered that it was over, that the stranger had done what no one else could do. The old bar owner limped to the river and looked toward the mountains. He saw birds circling above the burned road, and he knew. He whispered a prayer for the dead and another for the living. Elias walked alone through the forest, his steps heavy, the knife still at his side, his clothes torn and burned. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft with mud, and the world smelled of endings. He reached the old hunting cabin where everything had started and sat on the step, staring at the horizon. His body ached, every muscle screaming, but his mind was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when there is nothing left to lose. He thought of the boy he had saved and the look in his eyes, the mix of fear and hope. He thought of the people who had turned him over to the dragons out of desperation, and how he could not blame them. He had seen what fear could do to good people. He had seen it change them, twist them, break them until they no longer recognized themselves. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of peace, not the kind born from forgiveness, but from finality. Down in the town, the people gathered at the church, the same place where they once offered him as a sacrifice. They lit candles and spoke his name, some with reverence, some with guilt. They did not know if he was alive or dead. They only knew that the dragons were gone, and that freedom now came wrapped in the shadow of the man they had betrayed. As the sun climbed higher, the mist began to fade, revealing the hills scarred and blackened, and there on a ridge above the town a figure stood motionless, watching the valley below. Some swore it was Elias, others said it was a ghost or maybe a warning, but the sight of him made them bow their heads, because they understood now the truth that courage and vengeance were sometimes the same thing, and that monsters were not always born. Some were made by the hands of men and by the silence of those who refused to fight. When they looked again, the figure was gone. Only the echo of wind remained and the faint smell of smoke carried down from the mountains. The town would rebuild and the people would live again, but none would forget the stranger they had sacrificed to the dragons, and how the real monster had turned out to be the one who saved them.